I knew something was wrong the second I smelled it. It was just after 7 in the morning when I stepped out to water my tomatoes. The air was thick, chemical thick, not the usual whiff of someone's over-aggressive lawn fertilizer. This was sharp, metallic, and stung the back of my throat. I followed the smell to the far corner of my property, right where the HOA's maintenance fence backed up to my land. That's when I saw it: barrels. 4 of them. Rusted, dented barrels with orange warning labels half peeled off. One of them had a greasy trail leaking into the soil. I crouched down, already furious. Who the hell dumped hazardous waste on my land? Then I saw the sticker on the side of one of the barrels: property of Glenridge Falls HOA maintenance. That's when I knew exactly who was behind it. Glenridge Falls is one of those neighborhoods where the HOA thinks they're the FBI. And the queen of it all, Gloria Newton, 50-something, bleach blonde, lives on Sycamore Lane in a house that looks like it was built by a paint color committee. She's the kind who measures lawn height with a ruler and fines you if your mailbox leans. I stormed over to the HOA office trailer they had parked behind the tennis courts. Gloria was there, of course, sipping iced coffee and tapping her nails on a clipboard like she was conducting military operations. "Gloria," I said, "did your crew dump toxic waste on my land?" She blinked at me like I'd just accused her of arson. "Excuse me. There are barrels with your labels leaking sludge onto my soil." She actually had the nerve to roll her eyes. "That's not our waste. Maybe you should check with the city. Your property borders the utility line." "No." I cut her off. "Don't play with me. I saw the sticker. HOA property. It's your problem." She stood up, heels clicking on the trailer floor. "Mr. Lyle Maddox, if you're trying to intimidate me into taking responsibility for something we didn't do, good luck. I run this HOA by the book. Then you won't mind if I call the state hazardous waste team and let them sort it out." Her face twitched just slightly, but she recovered fast. "You do whatever makes you feel better. But I suggest you be careful with accusations. Slander is a serious offense." I walked out without another word. I didn't call the city. I called the State Environmental Enforcement Division. By the next morning, they were on site in hazmat suits, taping off the area around the barrels and taking soil samples. One of the inspectors, a short, no-nonsense guy named Ramirez, walked up to me with a clipboard. "Mr. Maddox, you were right to call. This is high-grade industrial solvent waste. Illegal to dump without a permit, let alone on private residential land. Can you trace it?" He nodded. "Barcodes match a purchase order from Glenridge Falls HOA. Looks like they've been storing this stuff off the books." I looked over at Gloria's house, where she was now standing on her lawn with her arms folded, watching the scene unfold like someone who just realized their entire scheme was about to burn down. Good, because I wasn't done yet. 2 nights after the barrels were cordoned off, I was in the garage reviewing the footage from my property cameras when a black SUV rolled slowly down the street. No headlights, just creeping along like it thought it belonged there. I tapped the keyboard, zooming in. The plates were covered in mud. Not splattered, deliberately smeared. The SUV paused at the corner of my lot, right where the barrels had been. A man stepped out, checked something on the ground, then got back in and vanished down the road. I didn't sleep much after that. By dawn, I had the footage on a USB drive and was heading to the local precinct. Sergeant Weller, a broad-shouldered guy with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, took one look at the video and waved over a deputy to start a report. "You said the state environmental team found illegal industrial solvents, right?" he asked, already scribbling notes. "Confirmed," I said. "And the barrels match Glenridge Falls HOA inventory." Weller narrowed his eyes. "They're not supposed to store hazardous waste, let alone dump it. They're not just storing it. They're hiding it." He nodded slowly. "All right, sit tight. I'll get our investigator assigned. This might go federal if the state team loops in the EPA." By noon, a team from the County Environmental Crimes Unit arrived at Glenridge Falls with a search warrant. They didn't knock. They marched straight past Gloria's hydrangeas and into the maintenance building behind the tennis courts. I was across the street, leaning on a neighbor's fence with a cup of coffee when Gloria stormed out of her front door in a satin robe and slippers, demanding to speak to whoever was in charge. A woman with a badge and a no-nonsense bunch showed her credentials. "Special Agent Rena Cortez, Environmental Division, State DOJ. "Step aside." Gloria's voice climbed half an octave. "You can't just barge in here. This is private property." "This is an active investigation following probable cause," Cortez said. "You'll receive a formal inventory of all items seized." For now, do not obstruct. I caught Gloria's eyes across the street. She didn't shout. She didn't wave. But her expression said it all. She knew I'd started this. They hauled out box after box folders, chemical logs, sealed drums marked cleaning agents that probably hadn't seen a mop in their lives. The maintenance foreman, a wiry guy named Terry, tried to slip away through the back gate but was intercepted by a deputy and cuffed on the spot. Cortez glanced my way as they loaded the evidence van. "You did the right thing reporting this," she said. "This isn't minor negligence. This is deliberate environmental fraud." "What happens now?" I asked. "We test everything. If the records show they knowingly stored and disposed of restricted compounds without permits, it's a felony. And if any of that leaked into groundwater, federal charges follow." I nodded, already thinking of the vegetable garden sitting 20 feet from that sludge. The next day, I was served a letter from the HOA. Not an apology, a violation notice. Apparently, my unauthorized surveillance equipment was not in compliance with community aesthetics. They demanded I remove the security cameras within 72 hours or face a fine of $300 per day. I walked it straight to the city attorney's office. They laughed. "Let me guess," the assistant city attorney said, flipping through the photos I'd brought. "They're trying to intimidate you into backing off." "They're not subtle," I said. "Well, good news," she replied. "The city doesn't recognize HOA aesthetic codes as enforceable if they conflict with public safety. Your cameras stay, and you might want to consider filing a civil suit." I already started the paperwork. 3 days later, the EPA formally entered the investigation. Turns out, one of the compounds found in the barrels was not only banned for residential use, it had been discontinued after a series of cancer cluster cases in the 80s. The soil samples from my property? Contaminated. They had to dig a trench, remove over 16 tons of dirt, and install a filtration barrier. I didn't pay a cent for the cleanup. The EPA billed the HOA directly. But it wasn't just about money. The agents found forged disposal manifests, tampered inventory logs, and records of bribes paid to a waste hauler who never existed on paper. Someone had created a fake contractor to funnel hazardous waste off the books. And the signature on most of the documents? Gloria Newton. I watched from my porch as federal agents arrested her on a Thursday morning. No robe this time, she was dressed for a board meeting, heels clicking on the driveway as they read her rights. She didn't resist, just kept asking if she could make a phone call. The neighborhood was buzzing within hours. Residents who had once feared her were now standing in clusters on the sidewalk, trading stories. One man, Harold from 2 streets over, admitted she'd fined him for oil stains that mysteriously appeared on his driveway the day after he voted against a dues increase. Another woman, Denise, said her rose bushes were cut down by accident after she questioned a landscaping contract. The HOA board held an emergency meeting that weekend this time, in the community center instead of Gloria's living room. I went, along with 50 other homeowners. The remaining board members were pale and quiet. "I make a motion," I said, standing up, "to suspend the current board and initiate a full audit by an independent firm." Someone clapped, then another. The motion passed unanimously. By the end of the following week, an interim committee was formed led by residents instead of Gloria's hand-picked loyalists. We brought in a forensic accountant who uncovered over $60,000 in unaccounted HOA funds. Gloria had been using HOA money to pay for consulting fees to her cousin's non-existent waste management business. By the time the state attorney filed charges, they included environmental violations, fraud, conspiracy, and misuse of community funds. I replaced my garden soil, rebuilt the fence line, and installed another camera, this time with night vision and a backup battery. Not because I was worried, but because the neighborhood was changing. People who used to avoid HOA meetings now showed up early. Neighbors who never spoke were organizing cleanup crews, planting trees, and repainting the park benches that had gone gray under years of mismanagement. The toxic dump didn't just poison my land. It exposed the rot that had been festering in the system. And once the light hit it, there was no going back. The day after Gloria was taken into custody, I got a call from a man who identified himself as lead prosecutor Daniel Hirsch with the state DOJ. He wanted to meet in person, not at my house at the county courthouse. That's when I knew things were escalating. We met in a conference room on the 2nd floor of the old brick courthouse downtown. Hirsch was in his 50s, lean with a buzz cut and a voice like gravel. When he shook my hand, his grip was tight and deliberate. "We've got a bigger mess than we thought, Mr. Maddox," he said, motioning for me to sit. The records pulled from the Glenridge Falls HOA's maintenance office go back 12 years. At least 3 previous board presidents appear to have signed off on fictitious contracts involving hazardous materials. I blinked. This isn't just Gloria? She's the most recent. But the pattern predates her. We believe they were using HOA funds to store and occasionally dispose of industrial chemicals under the guise of landscaping and pest control. They created fake maintenance firms and billed the HOA for services never rendered. We traced one of the shell companies to an address that turned out to be a mailbox at a UPS store. How does something like this go unnoticed for over a decade? Because most HOAs operate with minimal oversight. They're private associations. Unless someone files a formal complaint, the state doesn't get involved. Hirsch opened a thick case folder and slid a document across the table. This is a subpoena list. We're preparing to charge 7 individuals with felony environmental negligence, financial fraud, and conspiracy. We'd like you to testify regarding the initial discovery of the barrels and the HOA's reaction to your report. I read the names. Gloria's was at the top. Below hers, I recognized 2 more: Frank Delaney, the previous treasurer, and Carol Mendez, who'd served as board secretary until she moved to Florida last year. You'll get witness protection if necessary, Hirsch added. We're pursuing this aggressively. The EPA is backing us. The fines alone could bury them, but we'd prefer prison time. I agreed to testify. I didn't need convincing. Later that week, I received a subpoena to appear before the grand jury. When I arrived, the courtroom was buzzing. Reporters lined the sidewalk outside. A local news van was parked across the street. The story had leaked, and people wanted blood. Inside, I gave a full account from the morning I found the barrels to the footage of the SUV and the retaliatory violation letter. I handed over the original USB drive. The jury listened quietly. No one interrupted. No one needed to. When I stepped down, Hirsch nodded once. That was all. The indictments came 2 days later. 7 former and current HOA board members were formally charged. The judge denied bail for 2 of them after prosecutors argued they were flight risks. Gloria made hers. Barely, but her passport was confiscated. She returned home with an ankle monitor and a frozen bank account. Meanwhile, the community was undergoing a transformation. The interim committee, now operating under a new name, Glenridge Homeowners Alliance, voted to suspend all fines and fees pending the results of the audit. Residents who had once been afraid to speak were now volunteering for the oversight team. Yard inspections were halted. Financial records were made public for the first time ever. A bulletin board was installed outside the community center listing every motion, vote, and expenditure. Then, something unexpected happened. A man named Victor Chong came forward. He was thin, mid-40s, wore glasses too big for his face, and spoke with a quiet, methodical cadence. He lived on Ivy Ridge Court and had worked in chemical safety compliance for over 15 years. He approached the committee with a binder. I used to work for a company that manufactured one of the chemicals found on Mr. Maddox's land, he said during a committee meeting. It was banned in residential applications in the early 90s. I can identify the batch numbers, and I know where it was last stored legally. We gave him the floor. Victor explained that the drums likely came from a discontinued storage facility just outside town, one that had been scheduled for decommissioning 5 years ago, but never completed the process. He had photos, records, incident logs. And he suspected Gloria, or someone connected to her, had made a deal with the site manager to relocate the waste at a discount. He provided an address. The next morning, I drove there with 2 members of the Alliance, Denise, who'd lost her rose bushes, and Ramon, a former Marine who now ran a landscaping business. The storage site was surrounded by a rusting chain-link fence and a padlocked gate. A faded sign read, "Midland Industrial Solutions, no trespassing." Denise called the county. Within hours, a joint task force from the EPA and the local fire marshal's office arrived to inspect it. What they found was staggering. Rows of deteriorating drums, broken ventilation fans, no secondary containment, and in the back, records matching shipments billed under Glenridge Falls HOA. The waste hadn't just been dumped on my land. It had been moved repeatedly, illegally, across county lines to avoid detection. By the next week, the state filed a motion to expand charges against Gloria and the others. They were now facing federal environmental crimes under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The story hit national news. Residents of other HOAs started calling in, asking how we'd done it, how we dismantled a corrupt board and held them accountable. We began documenting our process, how to file complaints, how to demand financial transparency, how to establish legal oversight committees within HOA bylaws. Then came the civil suits. Over 20 homeowners filed for damages alleging wrongful fines, fraudulent charges, and property devaluation due to the contamination scandal. Several of them had sold their homes under duress when threatened with foreclosure over unpaid dues. Now, with the fraud exposed, they were seeking compensation. The court granted a freeze on all HOA assets pending the outcome of the trials. Meanwhile, the garden I had once feared was ruined began to show signs of life again. The Environmental Division had installed a new soil barrier and planted a cover crop to help restore nutrients. I added a raised bed for peppers and herbs. It wasn't the same as before, but it was mine. Clean, legal, safe. One evening, as I was trimming basil, Ramon stopped by with a clipboard and a beer. "We're drafting a new charter," he said. "No more unchecked authority. No more secret votes. Board members will be voted in publicly, and every decision will be subject to resident review. You in?" I signed without hesitation. We renamed the community Glenridge Commons. And on the day the new charter passed, we held a block party in the old tennis court. Children drew chalk outlines of flowers where the barrels had once been stored. A local band played bluegrass, and Victor grilled Korean barbecue on a handmade smoker. No one mentioned Gloria. No one had to. The poison had been dug out literally and figuratively. And now, finally, we could breathe. 3 weeks after the indictments, a quiet unease settled over Glenridge Commons. The headlines had faded, but the fallout hadn't. The former HOA board's assets were frozen, their trials approaching, and the community was still picking through the wreckage of over a decade of deceit. I hadn't planned on stepping into any leadership role. I just wanted my land cleaned and the people responsible held accountable. But somehow, I found myself sitting at the long folding table in the community center every Thursday evening, helping draft new bylaws with 12 other residents who were just as fed up as I'd been. One of them, a retired insurance adjuster named Lorna, slid a folder across the table toward me. I pulled some of the old insurance records from the HOA's policy. "Look at this line," she said, pointing to a clause buried halfway through the document, "environmental liability coverage. Canceled 6 years ago." Voluntarily, I leaned forward. Why would they cancel that? She adjusted her glasses and turned a few pages. Because they didn't want to report incidents. If a claim was filed, the insurance company would have audited the property. They knew what they were hiding. Ramon, seated beside her, leaned back in his chair. So they deliberately left the community unprotected to keep their scam running. "It gets worse," she continued. "Look at the new policy they took out. It's a general liability rider. Doesn't cover chemical exposure. Doesn't even cover property damage outside of HOA-owned structures." I rubbed my jaw, already thinking ahead. So if any residents develop health issues from exposure, they'll have no coverage. Lorna nodded. Exactly. Anyone who lived next to those dumping sites could be at risk. Especially kids. We brought the findings to Prosecutor Hirsch the next morning. He didn't hesitate. That's criminal negligence. If they knowingly removed coverage while continuing to store hazardous material, we're looking at willful endangerment. He took our documents, thanked us, and left for a meeting with the state attorney. 2 days later, subpoenas dropped for the HOA's insurance broker and the private risk consultant listed on the new policy. Turns out, that consultant was another one of Gloria's cousins licensed in name only, with no actual credentials. The consulting firm was a single-room office behind a dry cleaner in a strip mall. They'd forged inspection reports, claiming monthly safety checks and non-existent remediation efforts. This time, the charges were upgraded. Gloria and 2 other former board members were now facing counts of child endangerment and falsified insurance documentation, each carrying mandatory minimum sentences. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Instead, I started making calls. Every property adjacent to the common areas where waste had been stored got a knock on the door. We offered free testing, soil, air, even water if they had private wells. Most agreed, though a few were understandably cautious. Victor coordinated the testing, bringing in 2 colleagues from his old firm. Within a week, they confirmed elevated levels of contaminants in 3 neighboring yards. One family had a toddler with recurring respiratory issues. Another had recently lost their dog to unexplained kidney failure. We compiled the data and brought it to the state's Environmental Health Division. They acted fast. Medical screening stations were set up at the community center. Residents lined up to get tested, and the state dispatched a mobile response team to monitor long-term exposure effects. The local hospital got involved, offering pro bono evaluations for residents who couldn't afford care. That's when the lawsuits started piling up. Nearly 40 residents filed a class action suit against the former HOA board, naming both the individuals and the fake consulting firm. The state added civil penalties on top of the criminal charges, seeking restitution for cleanup costs and health monitoring programs. The HOA's legal defense evaporated. Their lawyer resigned after learning his clients had withheld key evidence. Gloria tried to delay the trial by claiming medical issues, but the judge wasn't having it. A court-appointed psychiatrist cleared her as fit to stand trial, and the date was set for early spring. Meanwhile, change was happening fast across Glenridge Commons. The committee finalized the new charter. Voting rights were expanded. All meetings were to be recorded and archived. Residents were allowed to audit financial records quarterly. No fines could be issued without a two-thirds vote from a rotating resident panel. We even voted to rename the streets that carried the legacy of the old regime. Sycamore Lane became Willow Cross. Ivy Ridge Court turned into Monarch Way. No one wanted reminders of the people who had let poison seep into our soil. And then, just when we thought we'd uncovered it all, we found the last piece. Denise had taken an interest in the HOA's old storage unit, an off-site facility listed in the old budget as records and seasonal storage. When we contacted the facility, the manager said the unit had been vacated months ago, but the contents hadn't been removed. Apparently, the auto payments had stopped after the asset freeze. We paid the small balance and opened it up. Inside were dozens of file boxes. Most were filled with ordinary receipts and vendor contracts. But one box, marked Archive B, held something else entirely. It contained detailed records of illegal dumping going back over a decade. Photos, site maps, even timesheets with initials. One folder was labeled Night Cruise and listed payments to off-the-books workers for after-hours chemical relocation. We turned the entire box over to the state DOJ. Hirsch called me that evening. "This is it," he said. "The last nail. These documents prove intent, coordination, and continuity across multiple administrations. This goes beyond HOA corruption. This is organized criminal activity." The charges escalated again. Conspiracy, racketeering, environmental terrorism. The trial began in early March. The courthouse was packed. I was called to the stand on the second day, asked to walk the jury through the discovery of the barrels, the retaliation I faced, and the chain of events that unfolded. I told the truth, plainly and without emotion. When the evidence archive was presented, photos of drums, forged logs, the signatures on the falsified inspection reports, the jury barely looked at the defense table. The verdict came after only 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Gloria was sentenced to 22 years without parole. The others received terms ranging from 8 to 15 years. The judge called their actions a deliberate and callous betrayal of public trust and ordered restitution totaling over $4 million to the affected residents. Half of that would go into a community health fund. The other half would be used to rebuild the infrastructure they had neglected: sidewalks, playgrounds, common areas. We didn't cheer when the verdict was read. We stood, quiet, united. Later that spring, the community center was renamed the Maddox Commons, not after me, but after what the name had come to represent: accountability. The new board voted to install a permanent environmental monitoring station near the site where the barrels had been found. Just in case, I still tend my garden. The tomatoes are coming in strong this year. No chemical burns. No oily runoff. Just good soil and clean water. Sometimes, neighbors come by to ask if I miss the quiet life I had before all this. I tell them no, because silence is what let it happen in the first place.